It is 6 o'clock, so we're going to get started. So, officially, I'm going to welcome everybody. Thank you for being here for another Women's Political Collaborative book discussion. We are very thankful for everyone who has continued to support our programming, including our book discussions since we kicked these off in March. COVID has had a huge impact in a lot of areas in our lives and with a lot of our organizations, but we have been very fortunate to be able to find success in bringing good programming to the community that people are able to participate in that may not have otherwise been able to do so if they had to go to a live event, and would have been difficult for us to have had as many events from a live standpoint logistically and so forth. So we're really excited to have you here. My name is Stephanie Williams. I'm the president of the board of the Women's Political Collaborative, and on behalf of the collaborative and the board, I welcome you here. We are excited about tonight's discussion on Black is the Body, because this is one of the unique circumstances where we have with us tonight the author of the book, Miss Emily Bernard, and so we're happy to have her. One of our former presidents of the board, Miss Lolita Tony, is actually going to moderate it with Emily, so that's very exciting. I want to, before I turn it over to Lolita, tell you about an upcoming event we've got next Tuesday, the 15th of September, a program that we're very excited about. We've got a lot of interest in it. A lot of people have signed up for it. And it's very relevant for today's time. And it's another cocktail hour, so bring your cocktails. But it's discussing when results in civility are stronger than parties or politics. And that's really interesting. And we've got some great participants. We've got former Speaker of the House, Beth Harwell, is going to participate. Former House Minority Leader Jim Henry will be participating, as well as former Speaker of the House, Jimmy Neffa. And we have moderating that former mayor of Nashville and former House Majority Leader Bill Purcell. So you can go to WPC10.com and sign up for that, find out more information about it. And while you're there, in the event you are not currently a member of the Women's Political Collaborative, with a few clicks, you can sign up to join and become a member of the collaborative, which is very important to us and very helpful to us to continue to support this program. And we do expect to continue this trend even beyond COVID, because it has been so impactful, and we want to make sure we keep people informed and engaged. So having said that, I think that's everything I need to say as an introduction. I'm going to turn it over to my predecessor, Miss Lolita Tony. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you, Madam President Stephanie, for that warm introduction and welcome. Hello and good evening, everyone. We're so happy you're here, and it is happy hour. So I hope you have your wine, and I hope that we will be sipping as we have a great conversation with Emily. So I'm glad to see you all here. I am truly excited to have Emily as part of this conversation. I remember having a conversation with Joyce and some other ladies several months back, and talking about really wanting to have authors who had a local tie and who were African American. And so when I got introduced to Emily's book through my sorority, I thought, oh my goodness, she is a Nashvilleian, and she's got this great book, and we should absolutely figure out if we can have her as part of our book and feature this book, because it's so interesting, fascinating. If you're from Nashville, or even if you've been here pre the Tall and Skinnies, there are things that she references in her book that will resonate with you. She talks about South Nashville, and of course she talks about Fisk and Meharry, and talks about North Nashville. And so it to me, it was really an interesting opportunity to see my hometown from the view of someone else, and particularly by Emily's purview. So happy that she's here with us tonight. And so I hope you have your seatbelt on, because I think we're going to have a really great discussion. And I am not the only one with questions. I want to certainly hear questions from all of you as well. But we're going to let Emily, would you please kick it off for us, please?
I'd be delighted. Thank you, Lolita, for this wonderful introduction. Thank you to Stephanie, and thank you, Joyce. It is a real pleasure to be here, and thanks to everybody who's come, and I'm looking forward to this discussion very much. You know, in ordinary times, I would probably have made 2 trips to Nashville um, since March. It's become more important. I mean, won't surprise anybody whose parents have passed, but you know, now it's down. You know, my brothers and I just feel even more tied to Nashville. I have so many family members there who maybe not related by blood, but certainly by things just as big and beautiful as his biology. Um, I want to start tonight just I think talking about this book in general and what made me um, write it and what it is I'm trying to do with it. I started writing essays at first. I actually didn't even think of myself as writing a book. I wrote the first essay that I published was an essay called Teaching the N-Word, the first kind of creative essay I published, and it came out in a rush. It was one of those things, I think I'd just been bottled up for so long. I do think of myself primarily as an essayist, but it took a long time to get to a place where I was able to come into my own voice as a writer. I'd love to talk, maybe there are writers in the audience tonight in the discussion, but it was quite a journey for me. But I'm here now and I'm not going anywhere. But I started writing essays, you know, quite some time ago. And Teaching the N-Word came about because, you know, in my teaching, I teach African American literature. And over the course of 20 years at this game now, I've had so many students of color come up to me and tell me that they wish they had a book that reflected more of their own experiences. And in fact, I had a student 4 or 5 years ago, a young Black woman who said, you know, we're reading the kind of greatest hits. And she said, you know, none of these women are like my mother, you know. And, you know, when we get to the greatest hits, you know, thinking about Native Son and The Street by Ann Petrie, Beloved, you know, there's a lot of trauma, you know. And so I had students who really felt like, well, what about the just everydayness of Blackness, and why isn't that represented, you know? So my book, I started composing with that in mind. I have a really good friend called Kevin Quashie who teaches at Brown, and he has a book called The Black Interior, it's called The Sovereignty of Quiet. And in the book, he's a beautiful writer. And he talks about, you know, the fact that so much of Black culture is expressive culture, you know, so much of what's represented, you know, in politics and kind of public culture. And he asks his readers, you know, we are Black in our interior as well. You know, we're Black when we wash the dishes, and we're Black when we walk our dogs. And I think my book, I was conscious of that. And the book is in many ways a refusal to conform to, I think, expectations about what Black stories should be. So that's really the kind of ghost thinking or ghost hand at work in the book, but it's also absolutely true. You know, I mean, every period, I mean, every sentence in this book. And it was definitely a challenge. You know, it's hard to lay yourself bare, but in my life, you know, that's the reading that has saved me. You know, the reading where a writer has put something on the line. That's the reading that has meant the most to me, and I needed to give back. I'm a teacher by nature and profession, and but in the essay form, I didn't want to write a book where I would be held to the same demands. You know, in the classroom, when I'm teaching African American literature, it's very important that my students take it absolutely seriously. You know, I teach at the University of Vermont. I have predominantly white students, and I'm here for them, and I'm here for my, you know, the kind of precious numbers of students of color that I have who need me, you know, up there at the front of the room.
Emily, you're muted.
Oh, have I been muted this whole time? Oh no. Oh, just now. Okay, sorry. I don't know how that happened. Sorry. So, you know, when you're teaching, it's a very linear kind of project. You know, you're starting, okay, we're going to start with the slave narrative, and we're going to move to the present. But when I'm writing, I am free. I'm free to wander, to contradict myself, um, to ask questions I don't have answers to. And, so to me, these are two halves of myself and my brain. The teaching half, which is very much about making sure my students are equipped with information. And there's a very simple project, which is to uplift and remember, African American writers, and leave my students with that, um, with an indelible, the indelible impact of that work, as I write about in Teaching the N-Word. But when I'm writing creatively, it's a way to capture another part of my brain and to ask those questions. It's a kind of cliche in writing that we write for ourselves. But I always think of a reader. I always think of myself in conversation with other people. And I was just teaching. I'm teaching Their Eyes Were Watching God in a class this semester, and I was asking my students to be mindful that the book is a conversation between two women, two Black women. And there's a reason why there's so many other people in this book. I'm very mindful of that and how much of myself I have created in relationship to other people. First, of course, my family, and then from there, this book I thought about very much as a woman's book. I'll say that right out of the gate. And I wanted to remember and pay homage to the legacy of storytelling in my maternal line. Every time I have a chance to even hear, I think about Nanny in There Was a Watching God, who told Janie, the main character, she said, I wanted to preach a sermon about a colored woman sitting on high, but there was no pulpit for me. And I think about the privilege, that I have in my life to be able to read and study literature. And the book is about, but, kind of building on that and building on what was given to me, and what do you do with this thing now? And, it's a book that was, many of the essays were composed long before I became a mother. But my relationship to writing, not surprisingly, has changed as I have, become a mother of daughters. And I think I'm not alone among the parents who are here tonight, watching my daughters. So much has changed for them, as growing up in this country, young Black girls, and yet so much is not the same. And Mary Baraka calls it the changing same, and unfortunately, painfully, and frustratingly, they dealt with a lot of things, in middle school that I had to deal with. And the difference being that they have a mother who is very well versed in how to talk back to this stuff, and is about the work of empowering them, which I inherited from my mother. But the book, I think, is asking questions, about these stories that are my legacy, in many ways, my inheritance. My mother's, her skills as a poet, and also her ferocity as a mother. And what about the story of race that my children are now inheriting? I mean, it's a book it really captures these moments in time. But as they get older, it's a different story, and there would be different stories. But even though I talk about this as a book, and I really do think of it as a woman, a book about a woman, very specifically about a woman. I think often male writers they tend to they take the podium relatively more comfortably, and they are comfortable making proclamations and talking in absolutes. I would say, if that's not too too broad of a stroke, but I think in women's writing, Emily Dickinson and her poetry, tell all of the truth, but tell it slant. And that really also, I like nuance, I like subtlety, and I like contradictions. To me, this is what it means to be human, and that's what the book, is trying to capture. So, to me, it's a book. It's a testament to the role that the reading of literature has played in my life. The reading of African American literature has shaped me, and these books, they course through me. Really, sometimes I feel very viscerally, So it's about the body of work that has made me who I am, and that, again, a way of studying and thinking about books that I inherited from my mother. And it's also about, I think, the ways that for many of us Black women, we carry so many histories in our literal physical bodies. I don't know who read that wonderful Alice Carolyn Williams, I think, piece. You want a Confederate monument? My body is a Confederate monument. Carolyn Randall Williams, this wonderful piece. So we all have these stories in us, and it's always a kind of process, I think, of figuring out what these stories mean. So maybe I'll stop there and see where we take it, Lolita.
Yeah, so I think that's really fascinating because one of the things you do say, one of the threads that's woven throughout the book is that you talk about the essay. You reference it as essays versus chapters. So these were individual essays that you had composed. And so when did you decide to make this into a book, to collaborate all these together? And how did you decide on this particular title?
Mm. Uh, uh, Thank you for bringing that up because, um, yes, I want to sort of come out tonight and say, yes, I feel myself very much an essayist, in the tradition of James Baldwin, Vivian Gornick, um, Hilton Als is one of my heroes. There are so many fantastic essayists, that I just, I've always just connected to the form. It's always made sense to me. And I think the way that the essay is a journey, you start, you make a kind of contract with the reader. We start with a question and we want to take you somewhere. And it's always just made sense to me. I've always loved that form. But, one of the other things that we say in publishing is that essays don't sell, unless you're Joan Didion or something. And that's what we heard for so many years. And so my editor, who has been in the business for, half a century, um, and for that reason, I didn't question her advice, but she thought that because of my academic background, that the term essay might be actually alienating, off-putting to people. And we didn't want, this book is not for, it's not about academics. It's not for academics. It's really just, I wanted to have the cast a wide net. So we used stories, and I thought, okay, how did I feel about that? Well, in the end, I really came to really love it because I really think of myself as a storyteller in the tradition of storytelling. It's very Southern storytelling, and Black Southern storytelling. And as not only a storyteller, but a story keeper. I feel that I feel my calling as a vehicle, for the stories, particularly of Black women who didn't get that hearing, and as I get older, the calling feels even stronger. I'd love to talk about my next book maybe later in our conversation. But I started to put, it came over time, so the first essay I wrote, 15 years ago. And uh, it just kept calling to me. It's where my mind went. The form started with the question. I think for me, at writing is so much about having a good question, and I think the distinction between making academic argument or being a journalist or a historian is that you have an argument. You want your writer to see what that argument is. But when I'm writing creatively, I don't know the answer. I have to write my way toward it. And that, of course, is then draft after draft. And you want to recreate that sense of discovery for the reader. But I wrote them over time, and I was really motivated. I mean, I could probably pick, from each one of them, there's a moment. The essay Interstates I wrote about my marriage. It begins with a scene of my husband changing a tire. I had that scene in my head for a good 6 years before I knew where it went. Honestly, I try it out. I tell people about it, see how they responded, and I talked about it, and I just knew it went somewhere. And then I think I was the gift was when that I write about in the essay, going to my college reunion, and my friend, a woman of color, who said to me, what is it like being married to a white man? She'd never dated anyone who wasn't Black or Latino. And I thought it was such an interesting question. And this woman I loved, who I knew well, it was funny for her to ask that of me after so many years of marriage, but it was an interesting question. And I thought, well, John has just called me for the keys. So it's like being married to a person who needs the keys, and I've always thought, as you meet other interracial couples, and I've always found it interesting the way that sometimes I would meet couples who say, well, we never talk about race, and I thought, well, that's kind of sounds boring and weird to me. And so I wanted to write an essay that, again, true to who I am and my experience, but very consciously, as a kind of refusal. I didn't want to write an essay about an interracial relationship that was like, this is so hard, and those stories are true too. I don't mean to, mock, that experience, because it can be very difficult. But these stories are out there, and I wanted to put something else on the table. And that motivation carried me through a lot of ways. I wrote this essay, wrote these essays. I wanted to tell a story that was reflective of the humor that really characterizes my marriage, you know. And there are things I left out. You know, I didn't talk about the fact that in my marriage, you know, people always make the assumption that it's race that is maybe the source of tension. But for John and me, it's class. You know, I grew up with my parents. They were professionals. They were, you know, had advanced degrees, and my husband comes from a working class Italian family, and his parents didn't graduate high school. And so people never imagine that, you know, because they imagine that, well, if you were to say these scenarios, you know, they would say, oh, well, of course, you know, they would sort of racialize that. And so the essay was written to say, guess what? You know, I mean, Blackness is bigger and more complex than that, you know, and interracial relationships, and of course, are shaped by so many other things. So there was that moment. And then I'll say also that the essay, Mother on Earth, was inspired by a conversation I had with a friend of mine who had, she was trying to conceive, and she ended up adopting a child, and then she gave birth naturally. And we had several conversations, and her daughter started to ask questions about her daughter that she adopted, started to ask questions about her, you know, original family. And my friend was so upset, and it was just, and I thought, you know, there's also this another pragmatic story to tell about adoption. And I had written this essay, I submitted it to a journal, and the editor's response was, well, what about the pain? You know, what about the pain of, and I thought, I don't want to write that essay. And again, that's a lot of, I want something else to be out there for prospective mothers, for children who were adopted. In fact, one of the great pleasures of the experience of having this book be in the world is the responses I've gotten from kids who were adopted, who've told me that it enabled them to have conversations with their parents, with their families they had not otherwise been able to have. And for me, so much of writing is about utility. You know, I think a lot about that. You know, how can my work be of use? And I think this has the base in a spiritual foundation. You know, thinking about being of use. It's really important in my life and in my work. And I wanted the book to be useful. I wanted it to be part of conversations. I didn't write a book that says I have all the answers. It's a book that says, use me in your conversations about some of these topics. And the book is meant to be that, and to have a different kind of perspective. So, you know, often there's a little bit, you know, that kind of ghost that's there that has determined what essays get written and how. And again, not to say they're all true, but I think we all have multiple ways of thinking about our lives. And so these perspectives were very deliberately chosen.
Thank you for sharing that. You know, throughout the book, you share these various experiences. Like, you open up with the traumatic experience of the man that looks like Gallagher, who stabbed you, and yet you talk your greatest pain, like even in that moment when you're stabbed, and it's like you are, as a reader, it seems like you're having an out of body experience. So it's like you're experiencing something, but your soul is having a different experience. You're even caring for the other young man that is injured. But you talk about the greatest pain comes from the surgeon who did not acknowledge you. And so we know that there's conversations about how people of color, Black people, have experience with healthcare professionals sometimes not acknowledging, not recognizing their pain. And then you talk about teaching the N-word, and you talk about your daughters. And I love how they like, we're not Black, like what, like we're not African American, we're brown. Like I'm trying to understand. And so there's these moments, and you know, you're in Mississippi, and you're with your husband, and then you say, race is trauma and color is beauty. And you wanted your daughters to know color before knowing race. And you have peppered all these experiences that when you go for the interview, and the Black woman who talks about how she couldn't be in an interracial relationship because she'd be afraid that, at some point a racial epithet would come up. And so you peppered this, and you even talk about how your dad really wanted you to go to Spelman, and how your mom really kind of set you up for the conversation of that you wanted to do something different, which I found to be very fascinating, how race is woven in, and then you make that particular statement. And you say, I think you say brown is my skin color, black is the body. So help us understand kind of really what you want us to be enlightened from as a reader based upon these types of pieces in your writing.
I love that. I want to just touch on some things that you said. First of all, thinking about how, this book, it's so much now describes my daughters as children, now as they are growing up and they're young ladies now. I mean, they are blackity black, I mean, my daughter, she's constantly, both of them are like on Twitter trying to start fights with white supremacists. I'm just telling them, they got Black Lives Matter banners in their rooms. They're ready to fight, and unfortunately for them, or maybe fortunately, here we are in Vermont, but they find the fight. And I knew that would happen, eventually, that they would, it's the world, But I must say, even though that's true, I don't ever want them to forget that they are Ethiopian, and that they have, this other experience that has named them and created them. And I think it's so important as many of our young people as we can get out of this country, just to see themselves as part of a larger narrative, not just one that the US has created for us, but we are subjects, in a larger story, all of us human beings. But it's something I would definitely want for my kids to be able to see that. Let's see. I wanted to say that also, yes, about the surgeon. And people often find that, but even when you said it, Lolita, I could feel it, I could feel it. The rage, I still feel it, this doctor. I have to tell you that I knew I had to write this essay, and that took many years to write. I was not in charge of the experience for many years. And I think still I'm kind of negotiating that. I was walking with a friend of mine, and we were talking, a Black woman friend who's a little older, I think her as a big sister. And we were walking and talking about these things. And I was telling her, the experience of being stabbed in some ways was not as bad as you think. And sometimes it's worse to read about some of these things than actually experience them. I mean, when I was just glad to be alive. I mean, I'm still glad to be alive, from that experience. But right, that doctor, I found myself again, in the grip of a narrative that I did not write. When he saw my body on that gurney, he made, and I actually, another doctor came the next day and kind of told on him, because I said, this doctor was just, what is wrong with this monster? And the second surgeon said, well, we're in New Haven. He sees a lot of gunshot victims, a lot of stabbing victims. And I thought, okay, he sees a lot of Black people, is what you're trying to say, a lot of Black bodies on his gurney. And, it was terrifying, it was terrifying. And I felt it the way we feel. I knew how utterly helpless I was. And, he did not see me as a human being. And that was far worse than the experience of being stabbed by a schizophrenic who was out of his mind, And I always tell, I said in the essay, I looked in the eyes of somebody, he wasn't home. There was nobody home. And I can't imagine somebody to do violence toward you when it's personal, which in some ways with the doctor who had all of the power, I felt that intensely.
I can't imagine being in a coffee shop, and that is like your greatest fear realized, that all of a sudden somebody goes out of their mind and just starts to stab you. Oh my goodness.
I mean, honestly, I'm glad he didn't have a gun. It's like it was 1994. I mean, now who knows what would have happened? But it was, and it's changed my relationship to the world, forever. But it's not unrelated, I think, to what so many of us experience in this life. How many stories we read every day about some Black person minding their own business, just trying to be a human being in the world, and we know what happens next. So I do think of the relationship between these things and what it means to live with these scars, to make meaning out of it, to try to make something meaningful out of it. So that's, I think, the real story here is, for me, all of these, there's there is trauma, there is trauma always in these essays. I mean, it doesn't often take front and center. And I like prefer subtlety. I have to be in my own writing. This is how I write, but it's there, and it produces, a lot of the situations, the thoughts, the predicaments I write about. But what we make of the trauma is always fascinating to me. I gave a talk, and a woman said, there are things that happen to you and things that happen for you. I love that distinction. So it's a continuous thing. You're trying to make meaning out of it. And I think I wanted to, when I sit down to write, I can bring my best self, to the page, my most loving self, and there are pieces of writing that start in rage. And in fact, when I wrote that piece about the surgeon, I had to stop and write him a letter, to burn him to cinders with my pen. My husband says I'm famous for my poison pen letters, but I had to stop because that rage did not belong in the essay. That's mine, Emily's, not the kind of storyteller in this essay.
Mm.
Sometimes you're talking to somebody and they are still very alive to a kind of rage, and you don't quite know what to do with it as a listener.
It's still seething. They're still seething. Yeah.
And the writing works when you can harness it. It doesn't mean that you can't, but the rage has to be conscious. It has to be corralled, so that the story can be told. We have to be true as writers to the story first. So I had to take that, and I had to write that letter. But of course, in the course of writing the letter, I came to see what the experience meant to me. It was in the course of writing it. And I don't know, I made all through trying to call and find out who this person was. Whoever got that letter, at least it ruined his day. And a surgeon got it with this guy's name, and he learned something, I hope. But it wasn't something I wanted to share, with my reader. I felt that was very personal. And I didn't know if I was committed. I didn't know. I mean, if he'd written me back, and we, that would have been something, to have a conversation, right? But I didn't imagine. I just wanted, I wanted to wound him. I didn't want to recuperate him.
Yeah.
But in the writing, I want to love, and I want to heal, and I want to, I want the reader to be. I'm going for an experience. I want the reader. I want the reader to feel safe, and to invite me on their own journey. I want to be a companion, and I think about this a lot, even the writing itself, and teaching the N-word. I didn't want it to be a lecture,
Mm-hmm.
and I hear this, and maybe some of us hear this, I used to get this a lot. My students know me better now, or, you learn, generations of students learn about you. But early on, I would get the question, well, why can't we say, why can't I, and I would tell my students, you can say whatever you want, but you have to face the consequences, like my grandmother would say, don't write a check with your mouth that you're behind can't cash,
Right.
like so say what you like, but people might not like it. You might pay a price. And so I didn't want to write that lecture. There are lots of great lectures out there, but I wanted to do something else. And that's even the structure of the essay, the gaps in there. I don't want to give you a simple answer. I want you to make up your own mind. You're a grown up, you're reading this book,
Yeah.
and I wanted to share these experiences, and also my experience with that word and with the implications of it. I still, it's a different moment now. But that's what I want to do. I want to raise interesting questions. I want to stand at doors that you are afraid to open. And so I have to be fearless. I want to be vulnerable because I want you to be vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
I want, I want to be truthful. I want to be authentic because that's how I want the reader to come to me. I didn't write a book that says, here are the answers, sit down and be quiet. I like to think that the book really demands some participation, in order to be experienced most fully. So that's what I was trying to do, create a whole, I think a lot about, like a record, I just wanted, okay, there's a jazz song and now there's a blues, there's something, and just a range of emotions and moods. I mean, that's my favorite thing when people say like, oh, I laughed and I cried and I was frustrated here and I was happy here. That's great. That's exactly, I wanted to to try to do all of those things and to create a kind of human experience, really honestly, an authentic human experience in this book that, that people could really could live with for a while.
I love that. I love when you're teaching the N word. I taught for 13 years at Tennessee State University, and I like to challenge my students when I was teaching, for them to get to an uncomfortable space where they can really start to really develop some critical thinking and to discover some things within themselves that they maybe were uncomfortable or did not know that they possessed. And I thought the way you was really interesting, because you would lay that out there and then you're like, okay, now I planted the seed. Are you going to water? Is it going to grow? Is it going to rise? And so getting them to this space of effort and yet being honest with themselves, I thought was a really good opportunity for them to grow as individuals. So have you had students come back to you after having taken that course and said, you know what, that was a little difficult for me, but I appreciate that you had me go through that exercise?
Absolutely. I'll tell you that my students were so wonderful. I was lucky to have, it was only 10 students. And they were already friends. They were in an honors college together. And I wrote the essay and then I shared it with them and said, whatever I need to change, I will change, but what are your and they got together and they said, we decided we'll be mad if you don't use our names, and I just love that. I mean, they were young and they were kind of free and, but yeah, so many of them have come back and talked about it, and many people have used the essay in their classrooms, which I think is great. But they've grown. I mean, now they're adults. Now they're in their 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have a lot. So I hear from them, and I see them, and I think it's always a surprise to see yourself represented, on the page. And but I love their sense of joy about it and freedom about it, that they felt, well, this is a story that can be really useful for other people. People can learn, from this. And I was very humbled by that. So yes, I love what you were saying too, Lolita, about putting people in a, just like you need to work with yourself. The questions you're going to learn best if you come to your own conclusions, and you do the hard thinking, as opposed to just absorbing everything I say, demanding them to be critical thinkers. That's exactly what I ask of my students as well. A life of easy answers does not appeal to me. And I can't live that way, and I can't teach that way, and I can't write that way.
Very similar to you. I've lost my mother and my grandmother. And so the stories are so important, and because that's the continuum of the legacy and the history. And I love the time you spent with your Aunt Julia, and even talking about your mother's hair and your grandmother's hair, and being the daughter of a father that's West Indian and a mother that comes from Hazelhurst, Mississippi. Very Black, and I know I understand the whole hair journey. And so when you shared about your father's lamenting about, I think is it Julia's hair?
Yes, that's right.
Yes. And then when you said that your grief by cutting your hair, I understood from a cultural perspective how significant that was. For our culture, for a woman, a Black woman, to cut her hair like that. And I cut my hair too. It wasn't when I had a passing, but it was when I was going through some breakthroughs and some challenges in my life. And I was like, okay, I'm cutting my hair. I'm shedding this, and then I'm going to do something different. So I love that you those stories that way, and I love that you shared, kind of what's culturally very significant to us. Now, is your Aunt Julia, is she still around? Are you still collecting stories and essays from her that you can put in some other collection or some other book?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I just spoke to her recently. Yes, and in fact, the next book I'm working on is a book it's called Unfinished Women. That's a kind of tentative title. I'm not sure how I feel about the title, but the idea is about, it's a book about Black women and a series of essays about Black women. And, the stories of my aunts and my mother and my grandmother, they're so much with me. And, what I think what we need is to remember our history all the time, because it isn't honored, obviously, and popular in the world and in this country and in mainstream discourse. I mean, that's getting challenged in a really big way right now, but it's important. And keeping the stories, my aunt told me a whole story about her life, and it formed the proposal for this book about women and the choices that we make, sometimes forced to make, and how we create lives out of mistakes and missed opportunities and the opportunities denied. We make meaningful lives anyway, and that's what the book is loosely about. The I guess loosely the idea is the unsung, and my aunt's way of looking at the world and her relationship to the past is something that still, it really pulls me. And I think about this wonderfully creative woman who's, never got to, have that platform and all of the women she stands among, so yes, I still very much, and sometimes I think there's a Hazelhurst book to be written, sometimes I think, I certainly was thinking that a lot before COVID, but it's such an interesting place, and but also deeply representative, of a kind of small Southern town where there's no industry and there are a lot of people trying to hold on to a culture that is under siege in some ways.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's a whole, I mean, even your family, the Jefferson family, like that whole story was so fascinating to me. And that you have captured it in such a way is remarkable, because that's the thing, like if nobody ever really captures it, and oftentimes we may be like, oh yeah, I'll hear that story later, auntie or uncle. Okay, yeah, I heard that story 1,000 times. But to actually really sit in it and really understand the value and the quality of what all of that means is really important. And so really illuminated for me. I'm going to open it up for questions to other people, but I want to say this. So I have, my youngest 2 children are twins. They're boy-girl twins. And my oldest is a son. And so I was very grateful that God only gave me 1 daughter, because I was never the lady that could do, I can really not even do my own hair. And so your whole transparency about that, and then saying, even as a Black woman, like, should I feel
Yes.
It's like we all have our gifts. And so there are people who are gifted to do hair, and that is how they make a wonderful living. And there are people who aren't do hair like me, and so I can help them make their living. So I had a very similar journey myself with my daughter, and my mother was very helpful. But I love your transparency in that, because again, culturally, it's like there's an expectation. And so, and there's no, and so should I feel shame that I can't? No, you know what, we'll figure this thing. So I appreciate your transparency. Okay, so we will take some questions from some of the people that are here on the Zoom. So does anybody have a question? Want to raise your hand? I think Joyce just took everybody.
Hey, folks, if you want to turn on your video, this is Joyce. If you want to turn on your video and you would like to ask a question, I just need you to raise your hand so I can unmute you.
There you go.
I don't even have a question. I've struggled my whole life. I have a PhD in literature. I've struggled my whole life trying to figure out what questions I ask authors, because I'm so grateful to listen. I've been riveted listening to your stories. I find them powerful and compelling. And I wish I could get my college children to sit here and we could push back the clock and start the whole thing again. Because there's I don't have a question. I just want to keep listening and then have discussion that kind of evolves. I wish you lived next door.
So I wish I did too. Well, I
How
would
did
say
you
even,
get back to Nashville, Kimberly?
oh, I try to get back at least a couple of times a year. My godfather lives there. My church home is still there. I try to get back. I mean, I don't want to be able to get back. Hopefully next spring, you know, I'll be able to get back there. But it's North Nashville has changed so much. We sold my father's office, and now, I mean, it's just a different place than when I was
Yeah.
growing up.
Does anybody else have a question? Just if you'll just raise your hand, I am glad to unmute you.
I saw a hand over here, Joy.
Wait, oh, I'm sorry, whose was? Oh, Gloria.
Gloria.
There you go, Gloria.
Hi, Gloria. Gloria's still muted.
Okay.
Hi, Gloria.
Hi, I'm trying to get there. Okay. Am I unmuted now?
You're unmuted, Gloria. You just remuted yourself.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Hey, Emily.
Hi.
Hi. I think you and I spent some time together, maybe the last
We
time
did.
in Nashville. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
we did.
it's great to see you. You said at the time that you were working on another book, and the book that you were talking about now is a different book. So are you still working on the other, I guess, is what my question is. And
Yes.
okay, good. But I won't say anything about it. I was curious about
Is
that.
that a trading information that we should know about?
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to talk, but you know what? Gloria knows about a book. Gloria and I have a mutual good friend, Ann Patchett. And when I sat with Gloria, they spent a lot of time together, and I was sitting with them on Ann's porch. We were talking about a book I'm writing. I'm going to be writing about my parents, loosely about marriage and my parents, my father, my complicated relationship with him. And actually, in the link that Lolita and Joyce sent out, there's a link to, I think it's Stereopticon, an essay that's sort of getting toward that. And, it's a book that I'm sort of gearing up the courage to write, but it brings up, I think, an important question that I think follows writers of memoir, writers of personal, essays. What is the relationship to other people, and how do people feel about being written about? What is the cost? People have asked me before writing about my children. And I actually wrote a short piece for LitHub about this called, "But what will your daughters think?" Because someone asked me that, and that's why I say it would be such a different situation now. I mean, getting permission from a 5-year-old is really different than getting permission from a 14-year-old who finds you too embarrassing to live. So, it's now a process of negotiation. I wrote it about my daughter for a piece for the New Yorker. It's also linked. And my daughter, we had to talk about what was in, and then New Yorker does a lot of this fact checking, and down to like, well, was your head like this or your head like this? And Julia's like, well, she said it was like this, but it was like this. So she was really present in the working of that essay, and we talked about what the impact would be, and she saw it and I think my daughters see it as my writing as an opportunity for them to shine. And they think of it as theirs, which is great for me because it gives me permission. But I think you have to be I think you have to be alive to the question. I know there are writers who just feel they can't write about living people, the people they love, and there are famous writers. Frank McCourt. He didn't write his book till after his mother, people had died. He didn't want to do that, and I understand that. There's so many stories, but for me, I'm so compelled by that question. And that line I wrote in the introduction in my book, being drawn to the line between self and other, and black and white, or whatever. I'm always drawn to the boundaries, and so it's just something I feel called to do, and I've learned from experience. Lolita, you asked about, there are essays that aren't in this book. I wrote an essay called Fired that I wrote, I think in 2008, that I really like. I still think it works as an essay, but it involved the breakup of a friendship, an interracial friendship. And the kind of, the lesson, I think, in that, from the experience for me and what I tried to capture in the essay, is that, there's so many factors that break up a friendship. And people were so very willing to see it as, well, of course, this is so difficult because I could point out some things that she said. Like, well, that's why we're not friends, because of these racist kind of moments, or maybe construed as, but that really wasn't why, and so I wanted to be honest about that in this essay, and to say that, I did use that as a shorthand, but really it was complex, and I miss my friend deeply. But I didn't feel it belonged in the book. It wasn't the kind of, it didn't tell a story that to me fit into the larger kind of world I was trying to create. But I also had, and largely because I had to, I can't say I regret the essay. After it came out, a reader wrote to me, a gentleman who said, respectfully, I have to ask you, if you could have your friend or the essay, which would it be? And at the time I said, the essay. And, I was a more dangerous kind of writer back then. I'm lucky to call Vivian Gornick a friend. She's one of my literary heroes. And she was talking about her early years writing for the Village Voice. She said, I was a reckless person. Everything was fair game. And I don't feel that way anymore. I think there are writers who do feel that way, that, this is my experience, I'm entitled to write about it. But I think for me as a mother, it's a different situation, and as somebody who also, is so deeply tied to my communities. So it's evolving, and I've learned, as I said, I don't quite regret that essay. It works as an essay, but what I think is that I wasn't sensitive enough to the person I wrote about, her circumstances in the world. I was pretty focused on my own hurt, and I regret the lack of compassion. I think the essay is compassionate, but I think I wasn't fully as compassionate as I am now. I mean, I think that I had a maturation process, frankly, and so it's not that I'm ashamed of that essay, but the thinking behind it, what produced it, is not the same person who wrote these essays, if that makes any sense.
So Joyce just shared in the chat that you are a staff pick at Parnassus, which is a local big bookstore, so which is
cool.
Awesome. So
that's great. Thank you.
Yeah. So question before we close out. So would you recommend that if there are people who are considering writing a book or have an interest in becoming an author, that they take a similar approach and maybe do a collection of essays that then they can, collaborate into a book? Is that a preferred style that you might recommend?
I think, for me, whenever I need that courage or need direction, I go to the writers who have sustained me. And I think that if you look at your bookshelf, and the books that speak the loudest to you are memoirs, then I think that that's what you have to write. I think if you look at your bookshelf and they're novels or short stories or books of essays, and that's what you have to write. So I think that the form, the story, I really believe the story finds its form. I think a lot of times, you experiment, and there's trial and error, and people have certainly mixed it up. People are doing that all the time. People who, seasoned writers who think, oh, I'm writing a novel, it turns out to be short stories. But I think certainly thinking in terms of chapters makes the process less daunting. I had a mentor who said that to me once. He said, I always think in terms of chapters. I never think of a whole book, as it would overwhelm me. So yeah. I think, so I think thinking discreetly, and don't forget that I think it's E. Annie Proulx who wrote the Shipping News. I think I read an essay she wrote. I read in an interview. She wrote 1 page a day. If you write 1 page a day, you'll have a book by the end of the year. So
I like my dissertation chair right now. Just do something every day.
Every day. That is my philosophy too. Every day, put your hand on it. Do something. And so I think that first I think you write, and you don't worry about the form. Don't worry about audience. Don't worry about anything like that saying. Write like nobody's looking. Pull down the shades, turn off the phone, and you are free. And you can throw it, you can burn it, nobody ever has to see it. And that's what you do first. And then I think you figure out what the story is, what you're trying to say. And then I think that story will find its form.
That's great advice. Thank you. So I just want to say there have been numerous comments in the chat. I don't know if you've seen it, but people have thoroughly enjoyed you, Emily.
Right.
And
I'm so
I'm
glad.
sorry, Dr. Bernard. We are so grateful that you have taken the time out to come and to be a part of our book club. And thank you for writing such an intriguing piece of literary work. As I said, I've read it twice, and it's like seeing a movie again. It's like I had new discoveries as I was reading it. So thank you so much. And but before you go, we know you have a couple of projects that are coming out, but also, what would you recommend that we should read? What would be some of your
Great
recommendations?
question. I think you all have to go to Parnassus and pick up Cass.
Yeah,
Let me tell
I
you,
just
that book,
finished that.
okay. I mean, I don't know about you, I read the first, I had to read that first chapter several times because I had to lie down. I mean, it was just overwhelming. And I thought, how can I live through this? And the
Mhm.
thing that is, he tells this, devastating story about our world now in this beautiful, sonorous prose. It was so, it's like watching like a horror movie, just with the gorgeous scenery. It's like I'm confused, but it was beautiful. But the thing about that book, it's so, I mean, you'll read things that I think especially if you are Black, there are things, experiences she tells you, you're going to say, yes, this is familiar to me. Or these are histories that were told to me if I didn't get them in school. But in general, it's an enormous education. But she has a vision, she has a vision. And that's what I loved about the book. I love how ambitious it is. I love how beautifully she writes. I love that she can take us, she starts out, in Siberia, I think, in that first chapter, and then we're in Brooklyn, So I love that book, and you can live with it for a long time. You will be frustrated, you will be enraged, you will be devastated, but she has a vision, and she's holding you, and she's going to carry you there. So I have nothing but respect for Isabel Wilkerson. I hope she wins everything. This book should be on everybody's night table. I think it's that extraordinary.
Mhm. Mhm. I agree. I just finished it, and I mean, there were chapters I had to go back and reread. And so, in fact, I started a book club with my family, and we're reading that book as a family to discuss it too. And it's to my sorority, and I hope that this book club will also adopt that book as one of our books, because there's so many layers to it, and
So
there's
many layers. Yeah.
much to really discover and discuss. So,
Yes. Yeah.
well, thank you again, Dr. We appreciate your time, and thank you, Joyce, for when I said this, when I recommended this book. Joyce said, "Can you get the author?" I said, "I don't know. We'll try. We'll see." And so Joyce is the lit list, and so we were able to make this happen. And I tell you, this has been extremely enlightening for me, and I hope everyone here has also enjoyed tonight's discussion with Dr. Bernard and her book. And let's see, I need to say, stay tuned for our next book. So, we hope that, we'll see you again in our next book club. Joyce, are there any other final thoughts?
No, just you can look online for our program next week that we're talking about civility and discourse. So just look for that, and we are trying to confirm our next author right now.
Mhm.
May I also say, my friend from childhood, Malika Bass, is here. Hi,
Oh,
Malika. I can see you.
oh,
Nice to see you. Here we are, grown up.
Are you in Nashville, Malika?
Yes, I am.
Oh, okay, good. We're so glad you're here. We're so glad to have you with us.
Well, it's great to be here.
Yeah.
And Emily, I'm just so proud of you.
Oh, much, Malika. It means a lot to me. Thank you. I'm so glad we were on this earth together. It's great to see you again.
I mean, your writing it's just so beautifully honest and courageous and refreshing. And when you mentioned earlier the greatest hits and the need to have voices and stories that are more reflective of just the diversity of the African American experience, the African American female experience. That is one of the things that I noticed about this collection of essays, and that it was something different and something needed and relevant. And thank you for writing.
Thank you, Malika, for everything you just said. Thank you for saying this. Thank you.
And my mother's been listening too.
Oh, is she here? Hi. I don't see her.
She's waving from across
Okay.
the room.
Please tell her to say hi.
Way back.
She wanted me to let you know how proud of you she is also.
Thank you.
You make Nashville very proud. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm very proud to be from Nashville. Nashville made me, so I'm very grateful.
Well, thank you all and have a good evening.
Thank you, guys.
Good
All
night.
right.
Good evening.
Okay, bye-bye, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.